In this lesson, we're going to focus on the App.tsx entry, which is the entry point for writing our own custom code. In the previous lesson, we successfully set up the iTwin viewer and used it to open the house model. Next up, let's talk about how we can customize the viewer to our liking. We'll head back to VS Code, and the file we want to look into is the App.tsx file. It covers most of the functionality that we've seen so far that the viewer comes with. Now, the iTwin viewer was written in React, so if you're new to React, please be sure to check out react.dev to understand this code better. We'll cover the key points here. Right on top, you'll see some variables that we get from our environment configuration. We have the iModel and iTwin ID, and these are the same entries that we filled out in the previous lesson in our .env file. They allow us to open the iModel that we want the viewer to work with. And then there's an optional entry for chainset ID, which is for opening a specific version of the iModel. If you leave this one blank, then by default, the viewer opens the latest version of the iModel. Next up, we have an access token for accessing the iTwin platform APIs, and we obtain the access token through an auth client, which we set up in the next line below. Now, the authorization client code is actually in a different file. It's in auth.ts, but behind the scenes, what's happening is we are using the same environment variables that we filled out for authorization client settings in the last lesson. From there on, in the app.tsx, we simply use these config items, both authorization and the iModel and iTwin, to get started. Now, that's all the boilerplate code that goes into getting started. We're not going to go into too much detail here. The key piece that we want to focus on is the viewer component that's part of the component body, this component right here. This is what's responsible for actually rendering the viewer that we see on screen here, including the viewport that opens the model, and also the UI pieces that surround the viewport, the toolbar items, widgets, and the status bar below. So what exactly goes into this component? It comes with several parameters that we fill out. There is the iTwin and iModel ID, chainset ID to open the specific version of the iModel that we want to open. Auth client for API access, as we talked about. There's view creator options for setting up our initial view. When we open our model for the first time, what should the view look like? That's being configured by the view creator options. Then there's enable performance monitors for tracking the performance of the viewer. This is for just internal updates and future releases. And they're the two key parameters here that we want to focus on iModel app init and UI providers. Now, this is the entry point for our code. iModel app init is a lifecycle method that is called when the iModel app first initializes. It indicates that we have successfully connected to the iTwin platform and we can access the APIs. So this is where we can actually start interacting with the platform. In this case, this method is being used for initializing some UI components, which brings us to the next parameter, UI providers. Now, this parameter is used for defining which UI pieces go into our viewer. These pieces are plug and play, so we can pretty much add UI components and remove them as we needed using these UI providers. There's going to be a lot more detail on this in a future chapter on UI, but for now, just know that this is where we can modify the viewer. Just to see what that looks like, let's remove all these UI providers and see what happens. We'll hit save, go back to our viewer, and you'll see that a lot of the UI has been removed. The toolbars, the widget, the status bar, they're all gone, and all we see are some basic tools that the viewer comes with. Now, this is the bare minimum UI for our app. So that's basically how the iTwin viewer works. Now, in the next lesson, let's take a deeper dive into the lifecycle methods such as iModel app init, which is the exact place where we can start writing our first line of iTwin platform code. It's exciting stuff, so let's learn more about lifecycle methods in the next lesson.